Hey, I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire Catholic Ministries, and I'm here with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to be chatting with you.
Brandon, always good to be with you.
Listen, we wanted to do this dialogue to talk about all the recent events going on in the church, from the Archbishop McCarrick scandal to the Pennsylvania grand jury report to the Archbishop Viganò letter. I know all this has been swirling around for you in the midst of a lot of travel. You just got back from the World Meeting of Families in Ireland just hours ago. You must be totally exhausted.
A little bit. We began the week with the priest conference on preaching. Then I went right from that to Ireland. And then, as you say, just got back really this morning. It was a good week, but a hectic week.
Let's start off with this, a general question. What was your initial reaction when you first heard about the McCarrick news and then about the Pennsylvania grand jury report?
Well, it was, one of shock and dismay and depression and, what other negative words I could possibly summon. I think with the Pennsylvania report, certainly we had known about sexual abuse by clergy going back, many decades. But some of the gross and terrible details that came forward were just stomach turning. And, I don't hesitate to say that there was really a demonic element that you see in these things. So that's what struck me in that awful Pennsylvania report. The McCarrick situation, that the abuse was going on at such a high level, the corruption to reach that part of the church's life. I also was struck by the similarity to a lot of the Me Too stuff, because not only was it a sexual assault, it was certainly that, but also a terrible abuse of power. So these young men who wanted the priesthood, and this was the man that could give it to them or deny it of them, and so it was a terrible abuse of power and authority. So there's some of the novelty, or that's some of the different texture, I think, in these two cases.
I know you're a student of church history. You're familiar with the long history of problems and scandals in the Catholic Church. How do you see this crisis comparing to past crises?
It's the worst in our history, meaning American Catholic Church history, for sure. If you'd asked me 25 years ago, I would have said that terrible period in the 19th century when churches and convents were being burned down, when there were political parties organized in an explicitly anti-Catholic way. But the scandals from 2002 and now this time far surpass that in terms of their damage to the church, their damage to people's lives. So it's the worst in American Catholic Church history, for sure. So it's important, I think, for all of us Catholics to realize we're passing through this particularly terrible time, and that we have to seize the moment. It's time for us to act. We can't simply be passive in the face of this terrible crisis.
I know the first instinct for a lot of people, and I'm sure you share it, is what are we going to do? We want to take action to not only bring justice to these situations, but to make sure they don't happen again. And we're going to discuss what we can do here in just a moment. But before we do, I wanted to ask you about how important it is to keep the focus on the victims of these egregious crimes and to call them what they are. They're not just boundary violations. There's something more specific and serious. Talk about that need.
Yeah, I think that was actually a helpful thing in the Pennsylvania report, is that they did away with a lot of those euphemisms, and they named what was going on, which was a great criminal act, the sexual abuse of children and of young people, the sexual assault of human beings. And so I think we shouldn't play word games, and we shouldn't cover up. We should say what these things are. Terrible crimes were committed. And crimes committed by people who were dedicated to Christ and to the church, and were meant to embody the presence of Jesus in the world, which made those crimes that much greater, that much more destructive, physically, psychologically, spiritually. The lives that were shattered by these acts. Maybe 50 years ago, people didn't quite understand that. If we don't understand it now, we're blind, deaf, and stupid. Right? That lives were shattered, broken, destroyed by these acts. So I think it is important for us to name them as crimes of sexual assault and sexual violence.
What's your take on the suggestion that many people have made that at the root of all of these problems is clericalism? What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, look, anything as complex as this phenomenon, it has multiple causes. I mean, so it's one of the fallacies in logic we talk about is the fallacy of single causality. Almost every event has multiple causes. I don't hesitate for a minute to say clericalism is one of the causes, by which I mean this terrible abuse of privilege and power. So a clergy person who should see himself as in service of the community, rather taking his position as an opportunity to exercise violence and power over people. So to that degree, sure, I'd say clericalism is part of the problem. But I also go back to what Richard John Newhouse said many years ago at the first wave of this crisis. The three causes of this problem are infidelity, infidelity, and infidelity. So certainly lack of faithfulness to one's priestly vows, one's priestly identity is absolutely basic. Is homosexuality something we should mention? Yeah, sure. I think 80% of these cases involve male-on-male sexual assault. Now, we always have to be careful, and it's important to make these distinctions. It's not to say that every homosexual person is apt to sexual violence, or that priests with same-sex attraction are necessarily going to engage in this kind of activity. Obviously not. There's no evidence for that. Nevertheless, there is evidence that the vast majority of these cases involve male-on-male sexual violence. Is that worth looking at? Yeah, absolutely. So I would look at a range of causes, those and others besides.
Let's talk about the effects of all of these instances of abuse. Yeah, obviously, we mentioned just a couple minutes ago, the focus should remain on the victims who are directly affected by this horrific abuse. But beyond that, how did these crimes affect the greater body of Christ?
I've said this scandal is a diabolical masterpiece because it undermines the work of the church in practically every way. Most immediately in my case as an evangelizer, talk about the best way to undermine any evangelical effort, an effort to propagate the church's teaching, to make the church attractive to people, to draw them to Christ. What would be a more effective way to undo that work than to have priests engaging in the sexual abuse of young people? In terms of our credibility, in terms of our role in the public forum, choose your issue. I mean, we're undermined in every way by it, which is why we have to come to grips fully with it. We can't rest until the thing has been solved. And I say that with a lot of passion because the work of the church, to worship God, to serve the poor, to evangelize, as Pope Benedict said, the three great tasks of the church, all three of them are undermined. All three are compromised by this work. Just think for a moment of the now in excess of billions of dollars paid out, dollars that could have and should have gone to the care for the poor, the building of institutions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just in that way, the church's work is dramatically undermined. So until we come fully to grips with it, the church is not going to move forward.
Now, one proposed solution that I've seen a lot, especially on the internet, is that the American bishops are so compromised that we need to just clean house and get rid of all the bishops. What's your reaction to that?
I never think that injustice is solved by more injustice. I mean, so I understand the emotional appeal of that. Like, let's just, clean house, get this thing. All these guys are guilty. That's simply false. Not all these guys are. And I'm not saying that in some self-serving way, but it's simply the case that still the overwhelming majority of priests and bishops are not guilty of these crimes. And so that sort of indiscriminate sweeping away actually produces more injustice, not less. It doesn't solve the original problem by adding more injustice to it. Secondly, more pragmatically, it would produce chaos overnight in a bishops' conference the size of ours. You're talking about 220 some active, bishops in this country, more than that. If you count all the auxiliary bishops, you'd invite chaos overnight. But the more fundamental problem is it's just a deep injustice. So I know it's emotionally appealing, but I don't think it's a morally attractive option.
And it seems that there are really two responses that are both necessary when it comes to the abuse crisis. One is the spiritual renewal of the church, the spiritual response. The other is the response of practical action, which I know a lot of people are demanding. After the McCarrick scandal broke, you wrote an article proposing one immediate practical response. And I'm going to quote you here. It's a few sentences long. You said, "I would suggest, as a lowly backbencher auxiliary bishop, that the bishops of the United States, all of us, petition the Holy Father to form a team made up mostly of faithful lay Catholics skilled in forensic investigation and empower them to have access to all of the relevant documentation and financial records. Their task should be to determine how Archbishop McCarrick managed, despite his widespread reputation for iniquity, to rise through the ranks of the hierarchy and to continue, in his retirement years, to function as a roving ambassador for the church and to have a disproportionate influence on the appointment of bishops. They should ask the ecclesial version of Senator Howard Baker's famous question, what did the responsible parties know and when did they know it? Only, you say, after these matters are settled will we know what the next steps ought to be." So you wrote that, I think, a couple weeks ago after the McCarrick stuff first broke. Do you still think that's the right move forward?
Yes, and I'll say it. I'm not trying to claim any great credit, but it was not long after I wrote that statement that the USCCB leadership came out with a very similar proposal, namely that we have to petition the Vatican because only the Vatican can police bishops. We can't really police ourselves in that strict sense. The conference cannot impose sanctions on bishops. So to petition the Vatican to sponsor a largely lay-led investigation to look into what made the McCarrick debacle possible. So I fully supported that. I mean, they were echoing a lot of things I'd said in my own article, and I still think that's the best way forward. We should keep our eyes on this particular issue. I know we're tempted to run in every possible direction to solve every relevant problem. And maybe in time, we'll see all those implications. But I think for the moment, to figure out what happened with McCarrick, how did it happen, and get at the responsible people. And to do it in a way that gives the priority to lay people skilled, as I said there in the article, in forensic investigation. I mean, I'm not skilled in that. I don't know all the right questions to ask, all the ways to analyze documentation, but let's get lay people that are. But then secondly, the church ought to give full access to the relevant documentation, to provide access to the relevant people, et cetera. So yeah, I would fully support and continue to support that approach.
Let's talk now about the spiritual response to a crisis like this. In times of great crisis and depravity, how ought the people of God respond spiritually?
First of all, it can sound, I know, like maybe a glib platitude, but through prayer, that we have to invoke the Holy Spirit. We have to recommit ourselves to Christ. So spiritually, prayer, absolutely. A return to the spiritual sources, not to run from them. I understand the temptation. People in their frustration, understandably, I get it, understandably, but will say, I'm through with the church. No, this is the moment to return to the great spiritual sources. That means the gospel. It means the Mass. It means the saints. It means all the vehicles of prayer, etc. So that's extremely important. And I have no quarrel whatsoever with lay people making their voices heard. So I made my voice heard as a member of the Bishops' Conference. Nothing prevents a layperson from saying, here's what I think the church ought to do. Bring it to the attention of the relevant authorities. The people of God have that kingly responsibility themselves. So all baptized people are priests, prophets, and kings. Well, this is under the kingly rubric of the governance of the church. Not the church as a democracy. I'm not proposing that. But the baptized have a kingly responsibility. So I think that's an altogether valid thing for the laity to do.
Let's talk now about the recent letter that Archbishop Viganò produced, this 11-page report where he makes some pretty blunt accusations against many high-ranking church officials. So I guess, first of all, what was your initial reaction to that letter? And then where do we go from here now that that letter's been sent out?
Well, it was a bit of a bombshell. I was in Ireland for the World Meeting. I was sound asleep, and I got a phone call to say, you have to read this. And it was the middle of the night. So I just got a sort of overview of it. The next morning, I actually did a first, cursory reading of it. And it was indeed a bombshell. I mean, extraordinary charges being made, including against the Holy Father himself. So it was a bit shocking, and especially in that environment. I was in Ireland, in fact, with the Pope for the World Meeting of Families. So it was to say the least unnerving, I think, for any Catholic, for any church person. Now, what do we do going forward? Here, I'd like to add my voice to that of the executive committee of the USCCB. So just this afternoon, Cardinal DiNardo, the president of the conference, issued a statement. And he reiterated what we just said. He reiterated what was said a couple weeks ago, namely that we should proceed with a Vatican-sponsored but largely lay-led investigation to figure out what happened with McCarrick. And see, I would say this. If you had asked me 2 weeks ago, okay, if you were advising that committee, whom would you say they should talk to? Well, on my short list of people to talk to would have been Carlo Maria Vigano, the Apostolic Nuncio, during some of these relevant years. Well, the fact that he's come forward now with a statement, I'd say, okay, fair enough. He's made his testimony. Now, do we buy it hook, line, and sinker? Well, no. I mean, in fact, as I read the document, there were things that seemed highly speculative to me, some things that seemed very driven by emotion. Other things seemed far more substantive and specific, and at least he claims tied to documentation. Worth looking at? Yeah, you bet. This is not some minor player. This is the former apostolic nuncio to the United States. When I was first made a bishop, I met my first meeting, and it was Archbishop Viganò who rose to speak to us on behalf of the Pope. So this is not an insubstantial figure. He's making some serious claims. I'd say look into him. Let's take an honest, objective look at what's being claimed here. See, Brandon, finally, the question that matters is, what's the truth? Right? The truth will set us free. And it's so easy, you see it all the time, to get distracted from that question. And I know people's emotions are stirred up. I totally understand that. And we tend to run off looking at all kinds of other related issues. Finally, in regard to the McCarrick situation, what's the truth? Let's do all we can to get at that. It seems to me that's the most important thing. Which is what I'd recommend in regard to the Vigano testimony. Let's honestly and objectively analyze it. Let this group we're talking about, Vatican-sponsored, largely lay-led, people skilled in forensic investigation, have them look into these claims. And then I think we'll get the best access to what the truth is.
I like what Cardinal DiNardo said in the statement you just referenced from the USCCB's executive committee. They just released this a couple hours ago, and I know you said you wholly agree with their angle at it. But Cardinal DiNardo said the recent letter of Archbishop Viganò brings particular focus and urgency to the examination. The questions raised deserve answers that are conclusive and based on evidence. Without those answers, innocent men may be tainted by false accusation, or guilty men may be left to repeat sins of the past. And what I like is he's saying either way, we should take it seriously and look into it, right?
Amen. I agree with that. Right. What's the truth? Let's find out. Anything else is going to get us distracted and will lead to moral trouble, as he's describing there. Either innocent people get off, or guilty people get off, or innocent people are blamed. What's the truth? What's the truth here? Let's find out. Only the truth will set us free. Should we be frightened or limited in that quest? I would say no. We should give this investigation full rein and let it have access to all the relevant documentation.
Let me ask you this. The church is not merely a non-governmental organization or charity. We're Christian. We're Christocentric. So where does the Lord come into all of this? What role does Jesus have to play in a crisis of this magnitude?
Well, he has every role in a way to play. One of the great mysteries, Brandon, is what they call the Mysterium Iniquitatis, right? The mystery of evil, physical evil. So, I mean, why do innocent people die in hurricanes and tsunamis and so on? But then this maybe even more troubling issue of moral iniquity. Why does God permit it? And the classical answer of our tradition is God permits certain evils to bring out of them a greater good. Therefore, we should always look at, okay, what is the possible good that might come of this evil situation? What are the signs of life we can look for? How is Christ cleansing and purifying his church See, to me, this time witnesses to Christ. It's not a sign of his absence. It witnesses to Christ. Think of John the Baptist, when he announces the coming of the Lord, is his winnowing fan is in his hand. Well, what is that? But he's separating chaff from wheat. It's a purifying, harsh process. Well, is the Christ who purifies his church now at work? Yes, and I would say, as a good Thomist, working through secondary causes. Like, for example, the indignation of the Catholic people. Like, for example, the anger of the laity. Like, for example, the anger of priests and bishops at their brothers who have done these terrible things. Like, for example, this investigation team that I hope gets formed. Christ, with his winnowing fan and working through instrumental secondary causes, does his work of purifying the church. So engage with him, I would say. The Christian life is not an abstract philosophy. It's a friendship with Jesus, a relationship to him. How is Christ alive in his church today? Precisely in this cleansing mode. He also says, in regard to himself, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. What's repugnant to the truth is repugnant to him. What is congruent with the truth is congruent with him. The closer we get to the truth of things, the more we're cooperating with the Lord who operates in his church. So I would talk about that. I'll say maybe a last thing about the spiritual warfare. I just spoke to these 300 priests at our preaching conference, and it was the feast day of the Queenship of Mary. And I talked about, that's not a twee sentimental feast. On the contrary, because Mary the Queen is associated with Christ the King in the Israelite tradition, with his Queen Mother. Well, they're warrior figures. They do battle with the enemies of Israel. And so now Christ and Mary, his Queen Mother, are warriors in the great spiritual struggle. Does anyone doubt that the demonic power has been at work in this terrible time? Does anyone doubt that? I think you'd be naive in the extreme to deny it. What's our job? Is get in the army. Get in the army of Christ the King and Mary the Queen Mother and fight with them for the purification of our church. Yes, prayer and through penance and through abstinence and through fasting and through raising of one's voice, through calling of the bishops or whatever mean you want to use, but to cooperate with Christ the King in his cleansing and purifying work. That's the spiritual call of our time.
Now, again, you just got back from Ireland a few hours ago. I know you're super exhausted, so I want to give you time to rest and recover. But any final words or last thoughts about the whole abuse crisis?
Well, I guess, Brendan, I'd say this, that there's so many different angles on this thing and so many things we can look at. And, people have been doing that over the past many years. But I would want to bring into clear and very sharp focus that we're talking about the victims of these terrible crimes. We're talking about young people who were sexually assaulted, who were raped. And we should keep that crime first and foremost in mind. That we're fighting in this thing is true, but we're fighting on their behalf. Institutional issues and all that we should look at, of course. But finally, it's about these people who were terribly, terribly victimized, and that we're here to advocate for them. And the reason we can't be silent and we can't duck the question and we can't play games is that these victims of violent sexual assault need to be addressed, need to be reached out to. Pope Francis says the church is a field hospital. Well, some of the people who are most wounded right now in the life of the church are those who are victimized by priests and by bishops. So that should be the focus of our attention.